Well, my great-grandfather was originally a fisherman from Cornwall. He came from Polperro, and he began to rise upwardly in the world when he became a coast guard, and he built his own home, which still stands there, called Grimsby House. He came up to via Haysborough in Norfolk. Now, there the family must have fallen on hard times for a while, because one of his sons, aged 7, was put in the Haysborough workhouse. From there they came up as far as Grimsby, so they were coming up the east coast by degrees, where he again took over his role as a coast guard. The family have always been involved in fishing, and my grandmother, in her turn, married a fisherman. That was the traditional way of earning a living. It was a very hard life for them, and they came slowly up the coast to Whitby, where they seemed to settle. Again, fishing was the thing that they knew how to do. My grandfather suffered a terrible tragedy when he was washed off the decks of a trawler. He was presumed to be lost, and then when they pulled in the trawl with the catch in it, sadly he was in the trawl net, and the crew was so upset that they came straight back from sea into the port of Grimsby. So he ended up being buried in Grimsby. My granny in turn married a fisherman. The family had a home in Scarborough in Castlegate, and she used to remember her father coming back down a side passage that ran at the back of the house, and the little ones used to wait in the backyard to hear him whistling, and then they could run inside and tell the mother that he was home from sea. And there wasn't a back gate into the garden at the back, and he used to throw his kit bag over the wall and then come on round the corner. They loved that home. It was a Georgian house. It had its own well in the garden. It was damaged in the First World War when the Germans came along the coast and shelled Scarborough, and it lost its back garden wall at that point, along with the houses on either side. So they decided to do away with the back passage and enlarge the garden, but it still stands there.
Do you know much about the fishing that they did? What kind of fishing they did, and the catch they did, and where they went, and so on?
Well, it was mostly cod fishing. They went. It was a deep water fishing they did. They weren't just down the coast. And as well as fishing, my grandfather became, for a short while, the skipper on a yacht that came into Scarborough, I believe. The legend in the family is that it was owned by a Hungarian count. It all sounds fantastic, but there's usually an element of truth in these stories that are passed down. If only I'd listened more carefully when I was little. His widow, my great-grandmother, sadly took to the bottle when her husband died, and she died of drink, and I have the coroner's inquest on it, and it said that she was found in bed with the baby by her side. And that was my great-aunt Esther, who was put in the Sailors' Orphan Homes in Hull. This was the saving of her, really, because I think she'd been put in the care of her uncle, who couldn't care for her properly. But for the rest of her life, she used to take me back to the house in Castlegate in Scarborough and say, "This should be ours." It was quite a poignant thing to hear her say that. She devoted her life to raising money for the Sailors' Orphanage, and again we have other family links with other children of our family who've been brought up in the Sailors' Orphanage in Hull. The fishing side of it, now then, I can remember quite a lot of the stories they told. They were very, very superstitious family. For instance, on land, my mother would always say to me, "Don't sew a button on wearing a garment because you're sewing sorrow on your back or on someone else's. If you had a tumbler and you clashed it with another and it rang, she used to say, you're whipping up a storm at sea. These were, the things I was brought up with, and I firmly believed. The men of the family would not go to see, if they met a vicar on the way to the ship, they would come back home. They didn't like women on the sea. They didn't like the colour green. They wouldn't even mention a rat as a rat. It was always a long tail. These were all the things I was told. And my mother had one saying that I've never come across anywhere else, and I've always wondered where the origin of it came from. When the big white clouds came up along the coast in winter, she used to say, it's going to snow. I can see them big Norwegian bishops coming up. And I've never known the origin of that. I'd love to know it. I can't remember all the superstitions that ran in the family, but my mother was an expert with fish. It was a very large part of our diet. I gather when a family were bereaved of a fisherman, the other fishermen on that ship would share the catch to include the widow and children. And I should think that was the means of survival for quite a lot of them. It was a hard life, and they were quite childish when they came back from sea, especially if they'd had a good catch. It was usually straight to the pub. The wives would be waiting at home with the children, and if they were lucky, there was some money left when the men came home. I had an uncle who was a radio operator on trawlers. He had tales to tell about the Cold War because he was given a very good camera by the government, and if he saw a lot of activity on the Russian ships, he photographed it. Also, when he heard a lot of chatter coming across, he would record that fact because they knew there was something brewing. I don't know that he understood what he was doing quite, but he knew damn fine that he was there working on behalf of the British government. All that came to an end when the Cod Wars broke out, of course. But after his death, the family did receive some recompense from the government, a small amount, I think for the role he played.
So when were the
Cod Wars in the 1970s. Yes.
So your family's been involved in fishing for a very long time.
Oh,
really?
yes. I mean, and the superstitions, I think you'll find in among the fishing families, they still continue. I don't know how much of it is general superstition or how much of it was peculiar to the fisher folk. But they were a very, very superstitious group of people. You never could put new shoes on a table, for instance. That was another one. I think they lived by the sweat of their brow, really. And I think the chancy nature of the dangerous occupation they went out to sea, never knowing if they would be coming back, perhaps engendered that superstition in them. Yeah. I'm not sure, really.
I guess they needed all the luck they could get, didn't they? And so if they had superstitions, it was sort of confirming.
Yeah, lucky charms could just, maybe swing good fortune your way. Yes.
So is there still fishing in your family?
No, not anymore. No, there isn't anymore. My uncle was the last one in the family who earned his living at sea. They never owned a ship. I mean, a lot of the smaller ones were part owned. They called it share fishing, when perhaps the father had the main share, and the sons or the nephews would go out to sea with them, and they would take a portion of the catch according to their status on the ship.
So is it all deep sea fishing they did, or were they involved in any sort of cobble boat fishing from the beach?
I think it was the deep sea fishing they did. But there was a photograph of the trawler where my grandfather was drowned, and it wasn't very big at all. I would think if you got maybe 6 or 8 men on it, that would be all you would get. And again, there is the coroner's report of his death. I think that's as much as I can remember off the top of my head.
No, that's great. That's great. Do you know much about the fishing industry today? How things have changed, or have you kept abreast of circumstances?
I have. It's out of your patch, Sally. We have friends who have a share fishing boat at Bridlington and some more further up at Filey. So it does go on, but I think it's more of a hobby now than the sole means of earning a living.
Because there used to be, my understanding is there was a lot along the whole coast,
yes,
sort of cottage industry fishing,
yes,
and then it's become sort of polarised in Withensea and Hornsey, the last few fishing boats.
Well, there's a lot of people who live in Holderness who still do fish. For instance, my daughter lives at Thurtleby near Coniston, and close by is a chap who fishes off Burn Point, and he often brings them a couple of lobsters home. You know, there's a lot of crab fishing down there as well. So it is going on, but it's not in an organised way with the big fishing companies and the big trawlers. Beverley was a town where the trawlers were built, you know. The River Hull here is quite narrow, and it's only deep enough at high tide to launch the trawlers. So the last trawler that was launched in Beverley was in the early 1970s. During the war, they were put on building minesweepers, and they used to launch them, as I say, sideways into the river, which displaced the water onto the opposite bank. So as children, we used to be waiting there with buckets and catch any fish we could, and all the eels. And this was the whole town used to march down there to get this, and this was a sort of little unexpected bonus in our inshore lives. But Beverley was classed as an inshore port.
I didn't realise that.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
So when did that industry stop?
That folded in the 1970s. It was a very thriving part of this town's economy, building trawlers.
I didn't know that at all. That's fascinating.
Yes, well, there's still a few of the models of them around, but they used to say for every man that went to sea, there were 7 shore-based jobs. That was because in Hull, of course, there were the big fish docks, there were the gutters and the fish bobbers, the bobber boys, and they too wore individual clothing. They all had abwool hats because it was very, very cold and there was a lot of ice about because they packed the fish in ice. Abwool sweaters and boots with big hobnails, and they were so quick bringing the fish from the trawler to where it was gutted. They used to slide along on their studs, and you could see sparks flying as they came down. So that was a job for boys as they left school, and then they would graduate up into perhaps going to sea when they got to be a little bit older. And it was a very close-knit community. People did care for each other. As I say, they were almost childlike, some of them, but they'd endured such horrible existence out at sea.
I guess they were entitled to that a little.
Well, I've always felt that, yes. And if they'd had a good catch, the wives would be treated to new clothes, and the children would be treated to a dog, and they would, spread it around because that might be their last time they would see their family. So they were living on the edge of that all the time. So emotions were quite heightened, I think.
Yes. Well, I can imagine, because it's like every day you go out to work might be your last one.
That was it, exactly. They knew that, yes.
That's fantastic.
And for my grandfather, it was his last one.
Yeah.
Well, I've been on a trawler, because one of my uncles was a trawler skipper. They broke the embargo on women. I was a little girl, and we took a little boat and we went to the mouth of the Humber, and we got on the trawler, and then we sailed in, and I can remember going up the rope ladder up the side. It was a big adventure. It only happened the once, and they showed us all round. Well, the table in the galley was on chains and it swung, so that as you were eating your dinner, I suppose your gravy went this way and that, and the beds were just bunks built into the side, and they followed the outline of the ship, so they were not even straight bunks. They were a little bit banana shaped at one end, and then the boat came out to guide them in, and I can remember Uncle George throwing over the side a box of cigarettes and a box of ship's biscuits from the store, and they were sealed in tin. They were like a great big oblong sardine tin, and you had to sort of pull on a ring because they were made watertight, and they were like sort of bigger, but the consistency of dog biscuits. And that was a great adventure.
I bet it was, yes, and to be a female and allowed on a boat was...
I know, it was wonderful. But they were all very kind, all very big-hearted people. I never met a miserable one in my life. They were very cautious in what they said about the fishing. That wasn't to be joked about. The fishing was the serious part of their life. And they used to follow the silver stream. I remember that was one thing one of them said, and I didn't know what it meant. I think it meant following the cod, because they had to rely not so much on sonar and stuff like that. They had to rely on knowledge and instinct and watching what the seabirds were doing. It was experience that made a good skipper, and people would follow a good skipper, or they would follow a lucky skipper. Oh yeah, he's had good luck, we'll go to him. So in a way it was like being a member of a big family. You got to know the good ones, and
I guess they needed to be like families because it was such a difficult working environment that they had to be able to work together and and
of course there was an odd bad egg in the basket. I don't know if you've come across the story of the skipper who beat a boy to death who went to sea. Oh yes, I think that one was quite well known in Hull. He was a Hull boy. He was only a schoolboy, really.
So what period are you talking about with that?
I think it would be the late 1800s, but he became a byword for cruelty because he beat this boy to death. I've never known another one though.
Horrible.